All right, so welcome everyone to the very first Innovation to Impact videocast. I'm Stepan Baran, and if you have been reading our newsletter, you already know that this whole thing started as a group therapy session that got really out of hand. So Brian, Nick, and I realized that too many brilliant ideas in drug development die quietly. And it's not because they're wrong, but because we chase tools before defining the problem. So we kept seeing the same pattern. The technology was exciting, the science was solid, but the question it was supposed to answer was never clear. So that frustration is what birthed this newsletter and this videocast. The idea is very simple: to talk honestly about innovation without the hype, without the buzzwords, and definitely without pretending that every shiny platform is a patient solution. So basically, all of the parts you cannot put on a conference slide. So we wanted a space where science, technology, and business could truly collide productively and maybe occasionally with a little humor. So the three of us come at this from very different angles. So Brian has spent years at the helm of translational science, living where animal models, ethics, and a real-world patient outcomes collide. He's the one who can remind you that biology does not care about your org chart or your timelines. Nick, the strategist, an AI skeptic / practitioner who can spot hype 3 PowerPoint slides away. He's lived the digital side of discovery and knows when data science actually adds value and when it's just theater. And me, I'm somewhere in the messy middle where algorithms meet the animal models, the biology humbles us quite often, Mike can say. And I started my career as a veterinarian, moved into digital biomarkers and AI, and now spend most of my time trying to convince very smart people that translation means more than just publishing another paper. So we built this newsletter, Ruminations and Rumblings, and you'll see us exactly do just that, to move past hype and turn real-world scars into usable guidance. So why this videocast? Because sometimes tone matters more than text. So you cannot really hear frustrations, which you'll hear that quite often from us during our various podcasts here, or laughter in print. And between the three of us, there's usually a fair bit of both. So we wanted to bring the conversation we were already having privately, usually while muttering about decision paralysis in pharma, into the open. So this series is where you'll see us challenge each other, disagree constructively, and maybe, just maybe, agree on accident. So before we dive into this first issue, let's do proper introductions. So I'll start. I already mentioned a little bit about myself, but my name is Stepan Baran. I wear too many hats: consultant, scientist, a part-time cat herder. With my background in veterinary medicine and translational innovation, and I spent my days working on how to make digital measures, AI, and new approach methodologies actually useful and not just impressive. So when I'm not knee-deep in regulatory frameworks or ROI models, I run a company called Bear & Cafe, which is less about coffee and more about rethinking how science gets done. And because irony is important, I also run Tech for Pets, where AI meets fur. So Brian, you're up. Tell everyone who you are and how you ended up here with us.
Great, thanks, Stepan. So I'm Brian Berridge. I'm a conventionally trained veterinary pathologist. I've spent most of my career working as a toxicologic pathologist. Mostly I work at the edge of my capabilities, not unlike what Stepan does. I've spent most of my career in drug development at NIH, and now I work as an independent consultant, largely supporting sponsors with cardiovascular safety assessment issues, but I also support technology developers. I'm a biology guy at my core. I'm as enamored with new technologies and opportunities to solve problems as anybody else is, but I'm most interested in how we ultimately solve the problems, particularly problems that we've got in drug development. I'm a bit later to this conversation. Stepan and Nick were already sort of wallowing in their issues before I was invited to the table, but I've really enjoyed working more closely with Stepan, who I've worked with for a number of years, and getting to know Nick. And as Shipon has told you, we tend to be more aligned than not in our perspectives and our experiences. So it's been a treat to sort of share ideas.
Right, I'll go. I'm Nick Kelly. I've also spent by now over 20 years in machine learning and computational methodology in health and life science. I've acquired my share of hats as well by this point in life. One of them of which keeps getting renamed, machine learner, biophysicist, computational biologist, data scientist, and that's fine. The other hat is pharma. And actually, I started there in a hands-on drug discovery role and computational role. These guys know I like to tell a story about when I was a postdoc. And, one Friday, the lunch lady in this wonderful Irish accent asked me, how are you doing and are you okay? And I realized that was the first time I'd spoken with another human being all week. And I thought, yeah, maybe something a little more dynamic and involving some small but still safe number of people might be nice. And drug discovery was this dynamic environment. It could really push medicines forward. But I became increasingly fixated, on the opportunity, to be more data-driven at scale, and maybe just had an easier time seeing what was brewing on the horizon, given my background. And so I made the jump to corporate, had the opportunity to assemble, our enterprise AI portfolio, innovation, talent pipelines, foundational partnership strategy, and it was really this latter half of my career that gave me the framework to think a bit better in terms of how we're innovating, how to take more of an ROI mindset, how to just make better decisions, both in terms of what we're investing our time and resources in, but just how to get better at getting out of the gate, planning for the future, in ensuring you're working on a problem that actually matters, right? And I've continued completely in that direction since, have transitioned on from pharma, and I'm now working more from an ecosystem perspective, working with startups and raising an AI Life Fund as well. But it was all of these learnings we were talking about that really formed the core of what the three of us found that we just kept discussing, and we wanted to not only share these learnings, but hopefully continue taking some back from any discussion we might have to anyone out there listening. So,
all right, awesome. Thanks, Nick. So now that everybody knows who's to blame for what, let's talk about the first issue of innovation to impact. So we called it patients first, platforms second. And because as much as we love technology, progress is not measured in algorithms or platforms. It's measured in whether we made a real decision that benefits someone in a hospital gown, not just someone in a boardroom. So you'll see that for us, we'll keep going back to that for us, the North Star is the patient. So Brian, let's start with your piece, Tails Wagging the Dog. You argue that innovation without direction isn't really innovation at all, and it's just an activity. So here's the question to kick us off. Is every innovation team in pharma tomorrow decided to define the problem before chasing the technology, what would actually change scientifically, operationally, or even ethically?
Thanks, Shipon. That's a great question. And I know that's a great question because you wrote that in the script that I'm supposed to say that whenever you ask me a question. But it really is a good question. But I'm going to back it up a little bit. I'm going to back it up to talk a little bit about why it's a challenge to actually define the problem in a meaningful way. And so, as everybody knows, pharma is a very long, complicated process with lots of contributors to it. And everybody in their space their space and scope of contribution has some sense of what the fundamental problem or problems are. And so everybody sort of pursues the solutions in that context. And so there's not really good alignment on what the fundamental problems are. And so we're pursuing lots of different things. So we're going in lots of different directions. We also live in a world where technology is king, and that king is evolving rapidly. And so, the idea that there's some magical solution that's going to be inflectionary and transform this this lot in life that we've been dealing with for decades, is something that's kind of appealing. But when you engage that rapidly evolving field of possible solutions without a clear sense of what your fundamental problems are, the result of that is essentially Brownian motion, right? So lots of things happening, but forward progress is not matching the level of activity that's happening sort of at the ground level. The other challenge with that is and this is a experience that I had while I was at GSK that was probably an inflection point for me. I was in a discussion with a senior leader, and I was presenting the latest brilliant idea that I had that was going to transform drug development. And I'm pretty sure he said, "Oh, Brian, that's a brilliant idea." At least that's what went on in my head. And he may or may not have said that. But what he did say was, he said, "Brian, do you realize how many possible solutions we entertain every single day?" And so as a senior leader, somebody who's in a position to write checks, I've got to figure out which check to write. And so that sort of really struck me that we're drowning in possible solutions, which again put more emphasis and to me value into really trying to understand the problem you're trying to solve. Because there's no way to get real traction in a possible solution when you're not clear on the problem that you're trying to solve. And it's absolutely true that there's lots of places where we could put effort and lots of potential problems that you could identify depending on what your benchmarks are. The benchmarks for me always are the cost, the time, and the rate of failure in drug development, because ultimately those are the things that affect patients the most, right? Their access to medicines. They're the ones who bear the brunt of the cost of the time and the complexity and the failure rates and the cost of those drugs. All that gets borne by the patient. So to me, that's the ultimate benchmark. So what I think we've got to do in these complex organizations is spend more time thinking about the problem and getting aligned on those problems and working across what we often refer to as silos and the disciplines and the people who are contributing to those things to make sure that we're aligned on exactly the problems that we're trying to solve, so that when we go out there and seek a solution, the solution fits the problem and not the other way around, which is far more common than not. So to me, the ultimate value and the return on that investment is a lot more efficiency and a lot more progress, because we're much more aligned in what the problem is and then getting the right solution to that problem.
Yeah, so thanks, Brian. So Nick, what are your thoughts on that?
And Brian's out to lunch is not an option, Nick, just so you know.
No, it's something I'm going to mention later. We've talked sometimes. I liked your story, right? Because I think one of the motivations for this episode was, the younger version of me could probably benefit a lot from some of the lessons we've had to painfully learn over the years, right? And one of those is this going from being, an expert in a small bucket and knowing it inside and out and being excited about the possibilities from it, to being a bit more purpose-driven, understanding the big picture, understanding the real world problems that are out there, and being able to adapt your thinking or even face some uncomfortable realities about, what is and isn't going to move the needle in those places. And so and I mentioned, I'm working with, some startups, things, and now it's like learning a foreign language sometimes. Things which seem like common sense and intuitive and like, well, it's not so hard. If I think back to how I was operating, especially coming out of university, it takes some time, right? And so like, well, what can we, but it's also not rocket science, so to speak, right? Can we help provide some, frameworks or guidance that exchange some with everybody else, that we could all benefit from, putting our time, effort, money into, the right problems at the right time as well, when technology is ready for it. So, that's something I think that probably resonates with all of us. And then, what kind of guidance can, there's always going to be somebody higher up in the org chart, right? How do you form a constructive narrative and guidance around, influencing this decision makings towards, the optimal outcomes, right? And so I think that's part of what this series is about too.
So Brian, so as a follow-up, with everything Davey said, how do we train our leadership, the C-suite, to reward problem definition instead of just emotion?
Yet again, great question, Shepon. That one's not in the script, so I just ad-libbed that. Actually, it's an interesting concept, training leadership. So you've got to first make the assumption that leadership is trainable, right? So I as we all have, I've had leadership positions throughout my career, and I'm trying to. That prompted me to think about, well, was I trainable, along the way? And so what I recognize about that is that I think I was trainable. I think I'm still trainable. I'm probably not to the limits of my being able to learn something new. But it's having the opportunity to be trained and be influenced. I think that's a real problem, right? I think leadership positions today are under such incredible stress, particularly from the business pressures that are, inherent in drug development, that it's difficult to be able to respond to being trainable. And so I think the intent is there. I think everybody wants to get better. But again, because we're faced with a myriad of possible problems, complicated by a myriad of possible solutions, it's very, very difficult to understand exactly where to put your chips. And so again, related to that and my conversations with that senior leader, that throughout my career, I just felt like, well, I could be more successful in selling my ideas if I could say them in a better way, or I could come up with a dollar figure that we're going to save all this money if we do this, or I could just, if my presentation was different. And so I constantly tried to evolve the way that I presented, a possible solution and my sense of what a problem was. And I, without recognizing how much competition there was for that space. And so I'm still struggling at this late stage in my career, and I'm still trying to figure out what's the best way to, clearly communicate an opportunity and a sense of a problem that somebody who's in a leadership position can actually wrap their head around, believe in, and ultimately decide that, okay, I'm going to put my chips here and not here because, the other part of that is I don't want them to do that just because Brian was better at presenting the idea. I want everybody to actually buy into the notion that if we solve that problem, we actually would have a better opportunity to be faster, cheaper, more successful, those kinds of things. So
maybe I'll respond to that one, Brian, too, right? I mean, yes, you don't want it to be because of a persuasive delivery, but I mean, part of that process is learning how to articulate the problem properly, and that you yourself have deep granular understanding of that problem, right? And then if you imagine yourself to be in the shoes of that leader, you can articulate and anchor on the problem rather than the solution. You can probably highlight, a couple other competing solutions and just say, listen, depending on your priorities and your risk tolerance or timelines or kind of, appetite to invest, here's the budgets, here's why I choose this one, but I'm happy to have an objective decision or a discussion. If you have reservations about that one, I think that's a great way of gaining people's trust, right? But it ensures we also are thinking about this properly, and that we also could make a good decision in that position rather than just trying to be a salesman, right?
Related to that, one of my personal weaknesses is I tend to be verbose, and I'm verbose because I'm trying to provide enough evidence for somebody to come to the same conclusion that I did. And again, a senior leader said to me one time, said, Brian, I absolutely buy into your sense of the problem because I trust you and your expertise. What I really want to understand is how this solution fits into all the other choices I have. Yeah. And that was an eye-opener for me, because I was giving less than the elevator speech because I wanted to lead them to where I was. And they didn't need to be led to where I was because they bought into what I was telling them.
But I guess one of the things, Brian, that you mentioned is the trust, right? So like in my earlier days, I kind of saw that it takes about 2 years for each level above me to kind of get one, trust me what I'm saying, but also learn the technology. So feel confident that they can go and then pitch it to somebody above them with that. And then so initially I saw it as a frustration, right? That why does my leadership take forever to do this, right? That process.
Yeah.
But then it does come down, then I started blaming myself, right? For kind of what you were describing, how do you communicate that, right? Why does it take me to get trust this long period of time, but then also communicate about the technology? So, the whole process takes about 1.5 to 2 years per each level, right? And moving that way, by then the technology is just, went through so many new versions, right? That what you're already pitching is already old. So I guess that's one thing that I've learned, right? That really the presentation of it makes a huge difference.
Well, and that trust issue, I think, is absolutely key. And one of the other failures that I've had. So this is all about learning from Brian's failures, because they have been many, right? So, and I'm going to share them all because I've got nothing to hide here. One of those has been recognizing that to the point you just made, is that trust doesn't happen overnight. And it's not just trusting me personally, but trusting in my sense of what the problem is or the potential solution. And one of the things I didn't do well enough was to engage people early in that evolution to allow them to foster and build that trust. I just went to them with a fully baked definition of a problem and a fully baked solution. And I didn't give them the opportunity to get to the place that I had gotten by engaging in the conversation, allowing them to comment on, to provide their perspective, to mold my thinking. That was a mistake, because I thought I was saving them time by bringing it fully baked. And I didn't engage them early enough, and I should have done a better job of that.
Right. No, thanks, Brian. So Nick, switching gears maybe a little bit, right? But so in your essay, will AI deliver new medicines? You basically told the industry to stop treating AI like a miracle button. And so the question for me, I guess, on this, which again, we prepped this a little bit, if AI isn't a silver bullet, how should scientists and executives think about where it actually adds value? So, and then especially when every investor deck has AI stamped on it somewhere, and it says it's going to solve the whole drug discovery and development challenge that we have.
So it's a good question. One of my favorite things to think about, discuss. And I think the first thing I will do is maybe back up a step. I think there's a larger trend and even a movement around proactive health that's being kind of driven by AI and digital. And in order to fully understand what's going on with pharma, you have to start there. And so basically think of digital tools, even endpoints, right, which enable healthier lifestyle changes, or it can track progress, earlier detection and screening, virtual care, improved adherence, which is something important to pharma. I like it being described somewhat as giving patients, consumers agency around their health, and this is going to feed back into the pharma strategy. Think of GLP-1 and even some of the medications that are going to be more proactive, and we'll definitely talk more about that in the future. But we can pivot and first talk about how AI will and already is impacting the scientific core of pharma, especially research and development already, which is maybe more where my sweet spot is. Can start with a simple statement. There's a ton of data in pharma, patient data to begin with. So think EHRs, real world evidence, and it's being increasingly consumed across the value chain. So sometimes in combination with our own trials, but from commercial viability to technical feasibility to patient, ideal patient populations, trial design, et cetera. The other huge bucket type is all of the assay data, so biomedical imaging, omics, preclinical safety in drug discovery. And here I think about it more as bringing these modalities together for more holistic decision making, structured and unstructured data, integrating the two of them. So from PubMed to compound assays to omics, all at the same decision. And think, accelerating research for, drug hunters, looking at target ID, or generative molecular optimization engines, et cetera, right? So accelerating the pace of insights and also helping to optimize, this new asset, clinical asset, this molecule that you have. And looking down the road, I tend to think of this as three key trends. And so there's, especially in pharma, closed loop coupling of AI systems to data generation, sort of tightening the loop between data generation and a new idea, whether that's a molecule or a drug target. In the future, we'll see this also going to be important for continuous adaptation, as we say, as digital solutions, be that a therapy or an adjuvant or, a screening tool, get pushed out into the population. The second, repurposable foundation models is an important concept, especially in life science. So, acquiring deep understanding from large public data sets, fine tuning for your specific use cases. And the last trend I usually think of as AI agents, learning how to collaborate together, just like people and human intelligence, to achieve like truly complex tasks. And pharma is nothing but one giant complex task full of complex tasks, right? I think, and then with this last point, I think the upcoming reasoning and foundation models will be able to even orchestrate these and break the problem down into manageable chunks. If you want to flip this around and think of the value drivers, you'll have, increased personalization of medicines, of therapeutics, of solutions. For patients, you'll have a better optimization of the therapies themselves. These foundation models, basically what they're doing is enabling a transfer of expertise. And, an example I like to think of is, if you think of digital pathology, right? So we have models that can kind of segment and kind of predict outcomes from histopathology images. And kind of what you're doing is basically taking the world's leading pathologists, building a model from their collective expertise. This can be scaled for efficiency gains, sure, but there's also an educational aspect helping to bring junior doctors up to speed better. And so there's a lot of possibilities there. And the last one I may have alluded to, that's this democratization of data, especially, let's say, real world evidence out there, data sets pharma pays a lot of money for. We have to remember that the LLMs these days are also great engineers. They can help non-experts access this data. They're great front ends. And so they're what's finally enabling us to use a lot of these models, knowledge graphs, databases, real world data, whatever type of data you have, enabling the democratization of this for non-experts. And so that's going to really help unleash a lot of the effort we've put in over the last decades getting to this point. So for me, like some of the most exciting ideas are those that are kind of aligned and future-proof to what's happening at this technical edge. But remembering that I think this wave of innovation is going to be all about empowering the healthcare professionals, the pharma workers who are doing their day jobs, and bringing more data to their fingertips, so to speak.
So I mean, there's a lot of ways to define AI, and I guess that, I typically split into two buckets. You have this administrative AI, right? It helps you with your operational efficiencies and a lot of other pieces there. But then you have this predictive AI, right? Which, we don't understand as well. It's called the black box aspect. You always worry about the accuracy and et cetera. So where do you see AI today kind of genuinely clarifying a go and no-go decision instead of just generating, another dashboard that we can look at?
So it's a good question. And, let's start again with the people, right? To be honest, a dashboard may be a great place to start. I remember one of our ClinOps projects, more of a control tower for our clinical trials. People just wanted real-time access to the data as is, just so they could better inform their decision-making and react. Once that investment had been made to like build a data foundation, enable them that window into it, and they started using this system, then you have the real estate to start, pushing the output of your predictive models, scaling them, because you have the data foundation, alerts on the window that people can actually see and act on or predict. And so whether we call it AI or dashboards, what we're doing is we're starting with data and we're pulling some insight or transforming that data in a way that can better inform a person's decision. And so when you're sure about the fact that there is a person who wants an insight from that data to inform themselves and is often working in this way, that's when you're starting with a problem, and there's somebody with a who wants the solution you're building, right? And so if you want to abstract this a bit into like what are the properties where we think this can have kind of the most transformative impact, we talk about how siloed pharma is, incredibly siloed. And so I think any solutions that can integrate up or downstream decision making, that can fix broken handoffs or break these silos, I think will be especially valuable. So, at first you'll be building tools that operate within that silo, but if you can start bridging things together, so, you might have a molecular optimizer, but now you eventually bring it together with a virtual screening platform. But eventually, maybe you can bring some models to ensure that it's compatible with downstream formulations or these types of upscale chemistry. Just so you're making better and better decisions earlier in that value chain, and you're actually using this tool and a data foundation to break some of the lack of communication that happens just out of this reality of an org structure and how you get 100,000 people to work well together. And so, I was trying to think, especially in the pharma context, what we want to do is flag risk that we might have missed, improve the safety, specificity, efficacy of a molecule, or even just better optimize a portfolio. And that's something that gains a lot of interest right now, not in pharma, but kind of everywhere, right? But pharma has its unique challenges here, let's say. And, Brian talked to some of these. You're operating at this interface between the connection of an optimal molecule, a solid patient population, and a trial. And so in between, there's this probability of success modeling. So, and that's how you kind of bridge the gap between the clinical outcomes and the molecule that you're shoving into the pipeline. Anyone who's looked at this can tell you, for the record, we spent a lot of time looking at this and had a collaboration even with Professor Lowe at MIT. One of the takeaways was, one, how miserable the industry as a whole still performs here, not much better than 10% for clinical programs, and two, the importance of having a biomarker, which brings us back to, we're doing data-driven insights to find out, that we need to be using data to find more biomarkers to double the probability of success. So it's just, the more systematic we can be about, having platforms designed to bring these insights to us, I think the better we'll be, from, better molecules to better designed trials to, better business decisions and portfolios. So yeah, I think that's. Does this answer your question, Stefan, or just create more of them?
No, it does. It certainly has a lot of, prompts a lot of other questions, but, we're going to have to move that to our next session, because even though, it's amazing how quickly time flies. And we know that between three of us going back and forth, but so for today, we're going to have to end there. And then so, this conversation really started because three of us were tired of watching technology sprint while the business of science limps behind. So pretending speed equals direction. So if there's one takeaway from this first issue, it's this: innovation isn't a race, it's feedback loop. And Nick talked about that, Brian talked about it. The progress isn't about adding more engines. It's about learning how to fly straight. And so before we can accelerate, we really have to steer. And before we can reduce attrition, we have to learn from it and from our mistakes. And before we build the next great model that everybody is chasing, we need to ask whether the question it is answering still matters to the patient, or if we're just circling the runway out of habit. So, these conversations that we're going to have will stay exactly as they begun, little messy, occasionally uncomfortable, but definitely always honest. So because real innovation doesn't happen in the takeoff, it happens in the landing. So thank you, Brian. Thank you, Nick. And thank you all for joining us. And we'll see you in the next Innovation to Impact videocast, where the only thing we automate is humility.
Thanks, guys. It'll be fun.